In this video, I'll be building this 26-inch bandsaw, and I'll be starting with the wheels. These pieces are going to form the outer rim of the bandsaw wheel. I'll need these holes through the wheels for mounting the flanges later. Next thing I need to do is to mount the bearings in the bearing flanges. I'm using my vise to press that bearing in because it's really hard to get in. Now I need to glue this flange on here, and that needs to be exactly in the center of the wheel. And I can use that point here to trace the circle to see if I'm centered. Those 4 screws are not for holding it down, they're just for recapturing that exact alignment. The second flange on this wheel is only held by friction, and I'll tweak that center of it once it's on the axle. Well, I think this amount of side-to-side wobble is as good as I'm going to get. Now to put in some screws so I can get that position back once there's glue in it. Next step is making a drive pulley so I can spin the wheels with a motor. Now I have to cut the V-groove in the pulley. Now I've tilted the router back a little bit to put this at an angle to make that into a tapered groove for the V-belt. I'm just temporarily attaching that pulley right now for turning the wheels. Got it ready to lathe down those wheels to true them with the motor. For the bandsaw tire, I'm using a 20-inch long inner tube, and this one I've already cut open. And the way I mount that on the wheel is by stretching it across and clamping it on opposite sides, then clamping it on the corner point and then stretching it over. And that way I don't have any areas that are overly stretched compared to other areas. There. Now I just need to build the rest of the bandsaw. Then over the jointer to make sure all the pieces are straight and flat, and through the planer to make sure they're all the same thickness. I cut 4 of these big triangles on the bandsaw, and now passing them over the jointer to make sure they're all straight and the same. I glued 2 triangles to this post just to get a start on things. This is the last back layer that goes on here, and then these braces for the prongs. But every time I put one of these layers on, I have to make sure that the wood underneath is smooth and flat so that I get a good glue bond overall. And you can see what a large overlap area I've got here between this triangular section and the post. I'm screwing on these pieces temporarily just so I can stand it up. The upper wheel should end up right about here. And now I need to mount the axles on it so that the wheels can actually turn. I just cut the pieces for this frame. Next I need to cut some rabbets right here. While the glue dries on that, I'll make the bracket that holds this axle. All the blade tension is going to be pulling down on this block, so I want to reinforce the corners by putting a spline in here. I cut rabbets on the edges of the frame to allow it to slide in the slot at the top of the bandsaw. Just a few reinforcing screws because that joint will be under a fair amount of stress. Those screw holes are just a little bit oversized so that plywood can tilt a little bit for tracking adjustment. Now I gotta make the bottom wheel mount. The mount needs to go right here, but this needs a little bit of flattening first. I only partially threaded those holes so that the bolts really get stuck in there. So this complicated contraption will allow me to tweak the alignment of the lower axle even once the bandsaw is done. I'm aligning that axle to be square to the frame, and then I use the position of that axle to figure out where I should put the back support for it. It's always kind of exciting getting that blade tracking on a bandsaw for the first time. And just trying it out by hand cranking it. Bandsaws really don't need that much power. Behind the lower wheel I need to mount this pulley. I left a few ridges so the rudder base had something to write on. I still need to make cutouts for the belt, so I gotta mark roughly where it's gonna go. These are bicycle brake cable cutters. They work so much better than bolt cutters. I'm mounting that pulley about 9mm offset from the wheel, and these things are spacers and also for screwing the pulley to. And now I have to make sure that it's centered perfectly before I screw it on. I used a total of 10 screws to screw that pulley on. It doesn't really get that much force on it, but the belt pulls at it in all directions, and I don't want it coming loose eventually. I've already made some cuts with this bandsaw I'm building, but it would really help to have some blade guides. And tapping some machine screw threads straight into the wood. Now I have to mount a bearing on a bolt like this, and I found this nut. It's got a flange on it. I have to put a washer on here, bearing on here, then this nut. Now I just need the guide blocks to go in there, and I'm going to cut these out of a piece of lignum vitae. And I need to make another blade guide column, and here's my blank piece for that. I made a spontaneous design tweak, which is to leave this ridge here and cut a slot for it here. And that prevents this thing from kind of tipping forward too much as I move it forward. Now I need to cut a notch out of here for this post to fit in there, and for that I have to figure out exactly where the blade runs. Got it all laid out and checked, so now I'm ready to cut a chunk out of that frame. I need to put a threaded rod in here, and this hole is a little bit undersized, and I'm just going to screw it in. And then this bracket was on here, and this thing goes on the back. The lower blade guide has a different mount, and I'm just using the templates for my plans for the layout. My slot mortiser would do a much better job cutting these slots, but I'm just showing that you can do this on a drill press. This time I'm using a bunch of lock washers to keep that bearing centered. And just put that on here. This is all a very temporary sort of setup, just so I can start using the saw before it's done. The trunnions on the bandsaw allow the table to tilt in such a way that the axis of tilt is actually at the top of the table so that the blade continues to go through the same slot as it's tilted. Now the top part needs to have a slot in it like this to swivel around the bolt. And after that, I cut to the final lines using my templates on the bandsaw. And then taking off the final little bit on my belt sander. Now the other part of the trunnion only has a hole in the middle layer. To accurately position this part on here, I'm just going to use a complementing template. I'm just going to put in a few dowels for this dry fit, but even so, it'll be pretty hard to get apart again. Now I just got to cut a big notch for it to fit over the lower wheel, and another notch to make room for the blade guides. Now I have to transfer the hole locations to the bandsaw frame. Now I have to work out where the blade guide mounting holes go. I gotta square out these holes for the carriage bolt heads. I still have to make a nice knob to go on the bottom. I'm using a notched glue spreader meant for flooring application to get an even coat of glue on there quickly. And then my big piece of veneer on top, and then some plastic in case the glue squeezes through, and a soft pad to get even pressure. And then gluing another layer of plywood to the other side, that is the bottom of it. After that, trimming a little bit off of each edge to make sure that all the layers are flush with each other. I'm adding some edge trim to it. So the table insert needs to go right about here. I'm cutting the hole in the table by routing around it with a 1/4 inch router bit. By routing around it again with a larger router bit, I get this nice ledge to hold up the insert. So I'll just mark where the trunnions ended up. So there's quite a bit that still needs carving away to make room for the blade guides and the blade as the table is tilted. I only filmed a few iterations of fitting and carving away and fitting. Finally, I have that space underneath the table for the blade guides carved out enough that I can tilt the table by a full 45 degrees. Making an insert for the table is my favorite part. This saw is now functional. Next step will be the enclosure. I'm cutting the material for the guard above the top blade guide out of some old radiator cover. And the guard fits around the wheel as it goes up. And that's kind of important because when I got the blade guide way up, that guard needs a place to go. The hinges for the cover will attach to this thing later. Now with this blade guide in place and this part and this temporarily here, I feel much safer using the saw because the blade couldn't come off in a way that it would hit me. So now I'm finally ready to try a wider blade on this saw. Works fine resawing this oak, but definitely could use more power. And I could also use more of an enclosure because that dust is just ending up everywhere. Now this will be the bottom cover, which will swing open like this. So this cover swings around the trunnions like this. I'm cutting box joints for the sawdust drawer. Box joints aren't really necessary for this, but with my box joint jig always set up and no need to change saw blades to cut box joints, it's an easy default choice to make. It's possibly a stupid idea to tip over the whole saw without taking any weight off of it. Oh shit, that's heavy. Oh. These things are shaped a little bit complicated because they have to fit around the wheels. Fiddly bits like this are best done without following the plans too closely. And now I have to cut out a notch for the trunnion support beam. So that still leaves a gap up here, so I put a strip of hardwood across there to close that. Now marking where the attachment knob is going to go. And the threaded insert goes into that hole. This board serves as a footstep for me to be able to adjust the tension crank more easily. And the hole behind that front layer is a little bit wider and a little bit higher up, which gives me a nice ledge to grab with my fingers. So I just used that back piece I already cut as a guide for how long to cut the pieces that go around it. For the pieces that go on the bottom edge, they were a little bit tippy, so I had to clamp some pieces of wood to the edge of them to keep them from tipping over, especially with all the weight stacked on there. Okay, the glue is now dry on this part, which is the front, and now I'm just going to glue that to the other part. That'll be the back. This is the box for the top cover, which I plan on cutting in two, but before I do that, I want to reinforce the corners with some splines across. The splines for the bottom of the cover are curved because I plunge cut those slots. With the splines cut and sanded flush, I need to split this top case open. Okay, I got the hinge screwed to one side. Now let's put this on the bandsaw. And now with the piano hinge screwed onto the cover already, I have to screw it to the saw. The blade guide's bumping up against the cover here, so I need to cut a little bit off of that. This part that covers it from the side. I still need to make a cover for that drive belt pulley sticking out the side. I cut a notch here to fit around part of the pulley right here. Why do I paint my bandsaws? I really don't need to emphasize that it's a wooden bandsaw. First and foremost, it's just a bandsaw. And then a few coats of clear varnish on top of that, both to protect the paint on there and also to keep it from rubbing off onto the workpiece. This part's going to support the enclosure. I just need some screws for that. To see if we can balance that, I'm just going to put a whole bunch of screws in here. Oops, that seems to about balance it as long as they don't fall out. I still need to wire in a proper switch on this bandsaw. And this bandsaw is finally done, but I know most of you would prefer something a little bit smaller, like my 20-inch bandsaw or the 16-inch bandsaw. But I think I'll keep this one right here for now. This one. And if you're still watching, I have a much longer series on building this bandsaw on my website, woodgears.ca.